Okay, everyone, good morning, Boker Tov. We have, you could see me, yeah. Probably easier than normally, I don't know. We continue with our discussion of this Nachash HaNechoshes, this copper snake that Moshe Rabbeinu made, and that ultimately we learned Chizkiyahu destroyed. So if you look on page 850, we see the following, 850. Interestingly, and we didn't touch on this yet, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu in Pasuk 8, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe aseh lecha saraf. Make for yourself a saraf. Saraf is a fiery snake, right? Fiery snake. What did Moshe make? Look in Pasuk 9. What did Moshe make? The Torah says, Vaya'as Moshe nechash nechoshes. That Moshe made a nechash. He made a snake. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, make a saraf. And Moshe Rabbeinu made a nachash. So you could look at this and say, come on, it's really the same thing. As we saw once before, saraf is a subspecies of nachash. In other words, nachash in general are snakes, right? Nachash is a snake. Saraf is a particular kind of snake that's referred to as a fiery snake, a saraf, because it injects its venom into a person that causes the person to feel like he or she is burning up. Obviously causes some kind of fever, an infection, whatever the poisonous venom does. So that's one way of answering the problem. God said, make a saraf. Moshe said, okay, and he made a nachash, because a saraf is a kind of nachash. But God didn't tell Moshe what to make it out of, right? Doesn't say anywhere, God doesn't say to Moshe, make a saraf out of nechoshes, right, out of copper. It just says, God says, aseh lecha saraf, make a saraf, right? Doesn't say what to make it out of. Now, if I had to choose what to make it out of, what would I have thought? What would I think? I think maybe I would make it out of gold, or maybe I'd make it out of silver, or maybe I'd make it out of some other material. I'm thinking gold or silver because it's, nicer than copper, right? Copper is less of an impressive metal than gold and silver. And if God says, hey, make this saraf, and people are going to be healed by it, so I think gold, come on. A gold saraf, a diamond-studded saraf, I don't know, something like that. Moshe decides to make this snake out of copper. So the reason is why, right? Why did he make it out of copper? Okay, so Sue suggests what Rashi alludes to, namely that in the expression of Rashi, it's lashon nofel al lashon, which means it's a language matter. Nechoshes, the word for copper, has in it the word nachash. So sort of like nachash, nechoshes, the two of them go together, so to speak, from a language perspective, from a literary perspective. There's got to be some kind of name for that in literary style, right? That there's, right, nachash and nechoshes. So if I'm making a nachash, so Moshe Rabbeinu says, you know what? Nachash and zahav, nachash and kesef, they don't go together. Nachash, nechoshes. All right, in the word for copper is found the word for nachash. That's what Rashi says. The Ramban says, give me a break. Right, not in that language, but the Ramban says, give me a break. I don't understand Rashi. Well, just because the word nechoshes has nachash in it, that's why Moshe Rabbeinu chose to make it out of copper. Just because the word sounds alike? The Ramban says no. The Ramban says there is a much deeper understanding here of this concept of nachash and nechoshes. And the Ramban explains it as follows. The Ramban says it's the derech of the Torah, and the Ramban is often alludes to the more mystical in his interpretation. He generally introduces that by the concept of sod. Sod means a secret, or sod literally means a secret. Generally, when the Ramban says sod, it means he's introducing some kind of Kabbalistic, mystical kind of interpretation. So the Ramban says, he gives us some medical background, first of all. Whether it's accurate or not accurate, I'm not sure. Part of it seems to me pretty far-fetched, but who am I to question the Ramban? The Ramban says that when a person is bitten. When a person is bitten by something poisonous, or like a poisonous snake or a wild dog or something like that, so for that person to see the image of that object is harmful to the person. So what does it mean it's harmful to the person? I don't think the Ramban is speaking from a physiological perspective. In other words, I don't think the Ramban is saying that if you see this image of a dog, you're going to physiologically do worse, or you see this image of the snake. But he says that it was common practice, at least in his day, to not even mention the source of the injury in front of the person who was bitten. My perspective, my understanding of this Ramban is that it was a kind of psychological thing. That if a person, and that if people are bitten by dogs, I don't know if any of you have ever been bitten by a dog, but it leaves a significant psychological trauma if you've been bitten by dogs. It's interesting. There are very few Holocaust survivors that I know of who ever had a dog. And part of the reason for that is because the dogs used by the Nazis, Yimach Shmam, left a significant psychological impact on the survivors. So it's very, in fact, I've never heard of a survivor. Maybe there are, I don't know. But you know anybody who's survivors who have dogs?
Well, at the time, yeah, they had dogs.
Yeah,
I do.
Wait, they had dogs when they, after?
Here, after the
Yeah,
war.
interesting. Interesting. But I've heard also of, people who were very fearful because of the experiences that they had. Certainly, if you've ever been bitten by a dog, it leaves a psychological impact, and you're frightened just to see a dog can trigger. Thank you. That's the word. Who can see a dog can trigger off the trauma of that bite. I would imagine if you've ever been bitten by a snake, right? If you've ever been bitten by a snake, so I would say more so, right? I would say more so, right? That it increases the fear that an individual has. So perhaps that's what the Ramban is referring to when he says that it was common practice that a person who was bitten by a dog, by a snake, by whatever, would not look at the image of those animals. And in fact, looking at the image of those animals would be harmful, not helpful. So I'm assuming that it's from a psychological perspective. Says the Ramban, in this miraculous intervention of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, there was b'derech haTorah nes b'toch nes. There was a miracle within a miracle. In other words, it was miraculous, the healing, but within the miraculous healing was another miracle. What does that mean? So the Ramban quotes two other examples. We know that when Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, as they traveled for a little bit, they came to a place called Mara. Why was the place called Mara? Anybody know? Anybody remember? Because it was a place where there was water, but the water wasn't drinkable, right? The water was bitter, foul, right? It wasn't, what's that word? Potable, right? It wasn't drinkable. So they called the place Mara. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say to do? When Bnei Yisrael complained to Moshe and Moshe went to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say to do? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, take a branch take a piece of tree, take a branch, and do what? And throw the branch into the water. Right? Throw the branch into the water. That would create the miracle. In other words, what happens? A branch, which is, a tree is bitter tasting. Not that I've ever tasted a tree, right? But a tree, one assumes, is bitter tasting, right? The bark of the tree, it's bitter tasting. Take something bitter, throw it into the bitter waters, and what's going to happen? The waters are going to become sweet, right? Drinkable. So it would make sense if HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you know what? Go to the store, buy a couple 5-pound bags of sugar, and throw the sugar into the water. And you throw the sugar into the water, and the water will now be drinkable. Because we understand that something sweet could take something bitter and make it more palatable. But to take something bitter and to throw it into the bitter waters, and for the result to be sweet water, that's a miracle within a miracle. The object that is harmful is cured by the harm itself.
Like the red heifer.
Like the red heifer.
When you grind it up, it's supposed to purify, but the original object is also contaminated. In other words,
That happens to be true, but I don't think it's the same.
Okay.
Right? In other words, I don't think it's the same thing. Right? To me, the idea, it's almost like, it's thinking like a vaccination, right? This whole tumult of, right? The whole tumult of vaccinations today. That I don't know. I grew up in a time when everybody got vaccinated. It was like you couldn't go to school if you didn't. I think you still can't go to school, right? If you weren't vaccinated.
these anti-vaxxers, that means.
Right, but there are people today who, there's a tremendous debate about it. If you look into it, it's not like a little thing. It's not like, there's 3 people who think it's not a good idea. There's a whole movement of people who think that it's not a good idea. And obviously there's a whole movement of people who think that it's endangering public health. Unfortunately, the Jewish community happens to be in the middle of this because you have outbreaks of measles, in Jewish communities where people, for one reason or another, have not had their children vaccinated. I don't want to make a statement about it here, other than to say that I believe in vaccinations. But nevertheless, the idea of a vaccination, how does a vaccination work? What did they inject into you? A little of the disease, right? They inject into you a little of the disease with the idea that your body is supposed to build up an immunity to that disease, and therefore it will protect you from getting the real disease, right? I pretty much believe that's the idea behind vaccinations. What? Maybe. I know the name. I don't know if he was the one who invented vaccinations. I don't know. I don't know, but right. Salk was polio. Whatever it is, that's the theory behind it, right? That's the theory behind it. Says the Ramban, right? That's the idea. He doesn't quote vaccines or anything like that, but he says that's the idea. The idea is that you cure, right? Kadosh Baruch Hu cures something bitter by telling you to put a bitter piece of wood in there. Elisha, there's a subsequent story in Tanakh of Elisha who made water that was salty drinkable by pouring salt into the water. In other words, it's a way of intensifying God's miraculous intervention. In other words, God could make salty water drinkable without pouring salt into the water. But if you pour dafka, what is making the water undrinkable, into the water, and then the water becomes drinkable, it is a nes bitoch nes. Says the Ramban, that's the principle here. The idea that a person looks at the snake, in order to be healed from the snake bite, is a nes betoch nes. Because according to what was common practice in those days, the last thing in the world you would do to be healed from a snake bite, the last thing in the world you would do if you were bitten by a snake, would be to dafka look at a snake. Here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes along and says, what's the cure for being bitten by a snake? The cure for being bitten by a snake is dafka to look at the snake. What does that do to a person? Right? It reinforces within us that this is not a healing that occurs in some kind of natural way, that the only reason I'm healed is because of some kind of miraculous intervention. Right? It's the miraculous intervention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that allows me to ultimately be healed from this experience. Yes.
How do you distinguish between looking at it and the magic of it? Because how do they interject God's presence? I mean, it's like almost like a voodoo doll. When you look at the voodoo doll, you're supposed to be cured, or the person that caused the trauma is taken away. It has a magical connotation that we're not supposed to deal with. We're not supposed to engage in anything like that. So it seems that this kind of thing is taking God out of the equation by making this replica that caused it, and you're looking, I mean, it's...
So I think you would be correct if it would not have been that God directed that this nachash be constructed. In other words, it wasn't like Moshe Rabbeinu came up with this idea himself. But just like God said, take the branch and throw it in the water, right? Just like God said to Elisha, take salt and throw it in the water, so too HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, make this snake. So when Moshe Rabbeinu makes the snake, it's not like, you know what, I came up with this idea. I couldn't sleep last night. I came up with the idea, maybe I should make a snake. No, obviously, Moshe Rabbeinu says to the people, listen, God told me to make the snake. So it's not like a voodoo doll. It's not like a charm. It's not like anything like that. But God told me to make the snake. Now, we learned last week that ultimately in the days of King Chizkiyahu, the snake had to be destroyed. Because this copper snake ultimately became an object of worship or false worship by Bnei Yisrael. What? No, it didn't. It's not that it still continued working, but sometimes things get passed down from generation to generation. This was known as the snake that cured people in the days of Moshe, and it became an object that was venerated. Right? That veneration turned into worship. That veneration turned into worship. And Chizkiyahu, we know, destroyed the snake. So there is an element of that, dangerous, slippery slope which is present, and that's precisely what happened. The question is, what took so long? In other words, how come the kings who came before Chizkiyahu didn't destroy the snake? If people had started worshiping the snake, and Chizkiyahu said, hey, this is not a good idea, so didn't the kings who come before Chizkiyahu also see people worshiping the snake? And didn't they also say, hey, this is not a good idea, and maybe we should destroy the snake? It wasn't like Chizkiyahu woke up one morning and said, hey, you know what? I see people worshiping the snake. That's not a good idea. I'm going to destroy the snake. Like out of the blue. Like there was a movement of worshiping the snake. Right? Obviously, it was something that had grown to the point where Chizkiyahu felt moved to do something. So you could explain it by saying that the previous generations, it wasn't so bad. In other words, there's a slippery slope to go from veneration to worship. And perhaps in the previous generations, it wasn't that bad. And in Chizkiyahu's generation, it was that bad. I think that's a simple way, by simple, I mean not complex way, of looking at it to try to understand what happened. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah gives the Gemara in Chulin gives another explanation. The Gemara in Chulin says the reason that Chizkiyahu's ancestors didn't destroy the snake was to give Chizkiyahu something to do. Interesting, an interesting interpretation, right? What does the Gemara mean? That the reason his ancestors didn't destroy the snake was to give Chizkiyahu something to do, right? It's like, right, like you know, what's the meaning behind that? That you know, there was nothing else for Chizkiyahu to do, so they decided to allow this Avodah Zarah to remain in place in order to give Chizkiyahu, you know, something to do. So I don't think that that's the interpretation of the Gemara. I think the interpretation of the Gemara is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for each person in each time a mission. And our goal in life, our struggle in life is to determine what is that mission for me. What am I supposed to do? What did God put me here in this world to do? Rav Soloveitchik says that is the existential challenge that we all face, and that is to figure out what we are doing here in this world. Like, what am I supposed to be doing? Why did God create me here? Did He create me here just to take up space? Or did He create me and put me in this world at this particular time, in this particular place, to have an influence, whatever it is? So the idea was that his ancestors, that it wasn't the right time to destroy this Avodah Zarah. Maybe they didn't even perceive it at that time. But this was reserved for Chizkiyahu, that everybody has this mission, and that was reserved for Chizkiyahu. It could be also, and this is why I brought up this discussion, it could be that the reason previous generations hesitated to destroy it is because this snake was made by Moshe Rabbeinu at God's command. So it's not, you don't easily destroy something like that. Yes, it's true. If ultimately it becomes an object of idol worship, then it has to be destroyed. But the other generations perhaps were hesitant because of the fact that Hashem told Moshe to make it, and Moshe made it at Hashem's command, and therefore it had a certain element of holiness that was imbued to it. Therefore, the previous generations were perhaps hesitant to go ahead and destroy it. And in Chizkiyahu's generation, it became more necessary to destroy the snake. Why was it more necessary in Chizkiyahu's generation? What was happening in Chizkiyahu's generation?
Maybe the people were losing spirituality.
Good. What was happening in Chizkiyahu's generation? What challenges did Chizkiyahu face? Anybody know? What was the miracle that occurred in the days of Chizkiyahu? So Chizkiyahu lived during the time of Sancheriv, or Sancheriv, however you pronounce his name. And Sancheriv was the Assyrian king, and he had come into Israel, invaded Israel, and it was Sancheriv who exiled the 10 tribes, right? He was the one who exiled the 10 tribes, and essentially the 10 tribes were lost to the Jewish people. His intention was not to stop simply with the 10 tribes, but that was the northern kingdom. There was a southern kingdom with 2 tribes left, and Sancheriv's intent was to conquer the southern kingdom as well, and to exile those 2 tribes, to conquer Yerushalayim. Chizkiyahu, who was the king at the time, ruled in Yerushalayim. Chizkiyahu instituted some interesting things. The tunnel that goes from the Shiloach to Yerushalayim. Any of you ever walked through that tunnel? Yes? No?
Yes.
Right? That tunnel
In the city of David?
it starts in the city of David and goes to Yerushalayim. You walk through it. It's very dark. It's filled with some water, depending upon the season of the year. It's definitely a chavaya. It's like one of those things you do between falafel and shawarma, right? So you have to do it, right? Chizkiyahu was the one who had that tunnel dug. And the reason for that was because he knew that Sancheriv was going to put a siege around Jerusalem, and there would be no way for Jerusalem to get water without this passageway, this tunnel that was dug. So Chizkiyahu faced this siege by the Assyrians around Jerusalem. Miraculously, in one night, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought a plague that killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. In Yirtzeh Hashem, we should bring the same plague in our day, right? Killed 185,000 Syrian soldiers, and Sancheriv decided wasn't healthy to stay around here, and he left and went back to Assyria. And Chizkiyahu was praised by this, and in fact, Chizkiyahu, the Gemara talks about the fact that had Chizkiyahu praised God properly after this miraculous event, he would have been Mashiach. But the fact that Chizkiyahu lacked that proper appreciation disqualified him from being Mashiach. However you want to look at that. So Chizkiyahu realized that Bnei Yisrael were facing a very existential threat from the Assyrians. And he understood that if Bnei Yisrael placed their trust in this snake, instead of placing their trust in God, that they were going to be defeated by the Assyrians. So Chizkiyahu understood that there was no choice in his day but to destroy the snake, which is what happened. And previously, why it didn't happen could have been because of the kedusha that Moshe Rabbeinu, so to speak, imbued in the snake by making it at a Kadosh Baruch Hu's command. So just an interesting perspective
So
there.
it enhanced the king's legacy. And
Chizkiyahu's
right,
legacy.
That he was allowed to do this. It was okay.
He made that decision, yeah. And obviously it was approved of. So,
What year was that, please?
so Chizkiyahu lived in BCE. We're talking BCE. Chizkiyahu lived somewhere around the 700s and 600s BCE. Okay, I would guess somewhere around 700 BC on either side he lived. Okay, remember we're going down because it's BCE, so we're going down. Okay, so that's the story of Chizkiyahu and this Nachash HaNechoshes, which was called in Chizkiyahu's days Nechushtan. Right? What does Nechushtan mean? Hanachash Shalanu, right? It's our Nachash. In other words, people started relating to it in that sense, which is part of what prompted Chizkiyahu to destroy it. Okay. How does the Megillah start? Just to switch gears a little bit and see if you're still awake. Right? How does the Megillah start? What are the opening words of the Megillah? Talking about the Megillah Esther, the Purim story, coming soon to a theater near you. Vayihi bimei Achashverosh. Right? Vayihi bimei Achashverosh hu Achashverosh. Okay, good. Right? I don't want to sing it to you because I've ruined the rest of your day. But Vayihi bimei Achashverosh. What does the Gemara in Maseches Megillah say about the word Vayihi? So first the Gemara says, whenever you see the word Vayihi, it is Lashon Tsa'ar. Right? It's Lashon Tsa'ar. It's not a good thing. Right? Tsa'ar and Tsarot, okay, related, that it's a signpost to tell you bad things. Vayihi, when you see the word Vayihi, it's a signpost to tell you bad things. Yes, Brenda? Oh, so says Brenda. Obviously, she never learned the Gemara Maseches Megillah, right? So, right. So Brenda asks the question, as the Gemara says, "What do you mean Vayihi is always bad? Vayihi er Vayihi boker, Yom HaShishi." We know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw these things and it was good. So what do you mean Vayihi is always bad? So the Gemara has a whole discussion there, and the Gemara comes to the conclusion not that Vayihi by itself is bad. But when it says Vayihi bayamim, so the expression of Vayihi bayamim is bad. Why? Because it just would have sufficed to have said biyamim, right? In these days, when it says Vayihi bayamim, the Vayihi is a conjunction of Vay, like woe to us, right? Woe to us. So Vayihi Vayihi bayamim, that's a bad thing. What's the opposite of vayihi? Vayihi biyamei is lashon tsa'ar, right? A time of trouble. What is the opposite? What's the opposite of vayihi? V'haya. Right? V'haya, and the Gemara Maseches Megillah says, V'haya is lashon simcha. Vayihi is lashon of tsar, right? Vayihi is something foreboding is going to happen. And V'haya, they both mean and it was in English, but they're different in Hebrew. V'haya is a lashon of simcha, indicating something good is going to happen.
It's just interesting that you start Shabbos with Vayehi and you end Shabbos Vayehi Dim Haya. Just an
Which also ends in Megillah.
Right, it also ends the Megillah.
Okay.
Okay, good. All right, Baruch Hashem. So look at the psukim in front of us. What happens? Says the Torah in Pasuk 9, Vaya'as Moshe nechash nechoshes. Moshe made this nechash. Oh, remind me, there's one thing about from the Ramban I forgot to tell you. You didn't ask me. This nachash nechoshes. Vayasimu al hanes, and he put it on the pole. Vayasimu al hanes, he put it on the pole. V'haya im nashach hanachash es ish, v'hibit el nechash nechoshes v'chai. V'haya, lashon simcha. What's so good about this, right? Is it good to be bitten by a nachash? So why does the Torah use the phrase v'haya, right? And it was that whoever was bitten by a nachash, it should have said vayehi. Vayehi is lashon tsar, right? Why does it say v'haya? Writes the Meshech Chachma that there is something special here. Let's say that a person was sick with an incurable disease and got bitten by the snake and looked up at the snake. What would happen? He would be healed. He would be cured. If a person was suffering from an incurable disease and got bitten by a snake and looked up at this copper snake, he would be healed. Says the Meshech Chochmah, that's the simcha. In other words, normally to get bitten by a snake is not a simcha. But if you're sick and you get bitten by a snake, it was like, whoa, thank you, right? There was simcha, right? Because if you were sick and you got bitten by the snake, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, you look at the copper snake and v'chai, and you're healed and you live. So if you had an incurable disease, your incurable disease became a curable disease. How? By looking up. If you got bitten, by looking up at the snake. That's why it says v'haya. That's why it says the Meshech Chochmah. There could be a simcha in that snake bite, right? And the simcha could be for certain people. It would help to heal them from terrible diseases. Okay. So the one thing that I didn't mention to you, I got started on the Ramban, talking about this nes b'toch nes, but I never told you the end of the Ramban, because remember the Ramban said about Rashi, what are you talking about? Lashon nafal al lashon, right? That it's nachash nechoshes, because in the word nechoshes, says the Ramban, no. Right? Within this idea that it has to be a nes b'toch nes, the reason Moshe Rabbeinu made a nachash out of copper is because the snakes that were biting, the saraf, had red eyes, said the Ramban, and a wide face, and a copper appearance. And in order to mimic, because remember what the Ramban said, nes b'toch nes, right? I got bitten by a snake. How am I going to get healed? By looking at the exact image of that snake that bit me. The snake that bit me had a copper appearance, had a copper skin tone, a copper appearance, and therefore And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu made this snake out of nechoshes. Had nothing to do with the language of Nachash, says the Ramban. But he made it out of copper because copper gave the same appearance as these snakes that attacked Bnei Yisrael. Any of you into snakes? I mean, there are some people who are into snakes. Are people who have snakes as pets? There are people who have snakes as pets, right? So, yeah.
Didn't you say, I think a couple of weeks ago, that God brought different types of snakes. Depending on what the people had done was different. There were more violent snakes, more vicious snakes. So wouldn't they be different looking snakes?
So everyone got the snakes that presented the real danger were the snakes that injected the poison into you. Right? Nobody else was in danger of dying. In other words, you could be bitten by a snake and be fine.
Oh, I see the difference. Okay.
So that's why. So there is a kind of pit viper, that's a species of snake, that is called a copperhead. Right? That is called a copperhead. You've heard of that before? A copperhead snake?
But do they have them in Israel?
They had them in North Africa, right? Could be that they had. I mean, look, they didn't have tachash in the desert either. What's tachash? Some say tachash is a unicorn. Some say tachash is a seal. Whatever. They didn't have those animals in the midbar either. But Hakadosh Baruch Hu created those animals in the midbar because they needed the skins for the Mishkan.
We also learned 100 years ago that the midbar was full of
Snakes and scorpions, right? Somebody asked if the copperhead was dafka. I don't know that the copperhead was the poisonous snake, but the idea that there is such a snake and it's called a copperhead sort of supports a little bit what the Ramban is saying, that this poisonous snake gave off this copper appearance, right? Okay.
I also would imagine that after the Egel HaZahav, you wouldn't you necessarily use gold to create a creature for any purpose whatsoever.
They used tons of gold in
Not for, I mean, maybe.
the Kruvim.
Just the Kruvim, but.
Okay, they used tons of gold. There was tons of gold used. Yes. Okay. In the building of the Mishkan. I mean, you had a golden mizbeach, you had a golden menorah, you had a golden shulchan, you had a golden aron, right? You had golden kruvim. So Sue is saying that, it makes sense not to make the snake out of gold because they made an egel out of gold, and look what happened when they did that. Okay, so here, they made making a snake out of gold might not have been such a good idea. I hear that, but on the other hand, there are lots of things made out of gold, so. Okay, so that's the Nachash Nechoshes, and that, according to the Meshech Chochmah, is why the language of V'haya is used here, because it had this power. And the final thing that we learned last week was the idea that if you were bitten by anything, even if you were bitten by a dog, if you looked up at the snake, you would be healed from that bite. But if you were bitten by a fiery serpent, it wasn't enough to simply glance at the snake. It wasn't a vira'ah, just to look up and to see the snake. If you were bitten by a fiery serpent, going along the lines that was the most severe punishment, so you had to be vihibit. You had to be intently staring at the snake in order to be healed. In other words, you had to pay more attention to it because you had more tshuva to do. That if you were bitten by a fiery serpent, and that was the greatest punishment here, that means that you were a person who had the most tshuva to do. So you had to really stare at the snake and contemplate the fact that, hey, I'm being healed because HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is creating this healing mechanism, and therefore I need to do tshuva and appreciate the role of God in the world. That's the idea which is present here. Okay. So this is the episode of the fiery snakes, and pasuk. Let's look at pasuk 10. The fiery snakes are over, and Bnei Yisrael are once again on the move. Where did Bnei Yisrael go? Says the Torah, Vayis'u b'nei Yisrael, that b'nei Yisrael travels, Vayachanu ba'avos. And there they go to the land of Avos. We're on page 850, Pasuk 10. They go to the land of Avos, and we see they travel from Avos, Vayis'u me Avos vayachanu bi'iyei ha'avarim. They go from Avos. I don't know if any of you have the maps that I had previously handed out. I'm sure some of you do, right? They traveled from Avos to Iyei ha'avarim b'midbar asher al pnei Moav mimizrach hashamesh. Right? They are now approaching the land of Moab. Misham nasa'u, from there they traveled, vayachanu b'nachal zared, and they went to Nachal Zared. Misham nasa'u, from there they traveled, vayachanu me'aver Arnon, and they went to Aver Arnon. You have I see you have it. You have the spaces, the places there. Yes. All right. Look at Kadesh. Remember, where are Bnei Yisrael? They're now traveling around Edom. Right. They weren't allowed to go through Edom. They had to travel around Edom, and now they're heading north. Who are they going to meet when they go up north? Moab. They're going to meet Moab up north. All right, well, that's ultimately what we are getting to here. Okay, that they're going to meet Moab up north. So they go vayachanu bi'iyei ha'avarim ba'midbar asher al pnei Moab mimizrach hashamesh, right, which is by Moab mimizrach hashamesh. Misham nasa'u vayachanu b'nachal zared. Misham nasa'u vayachanu me'aver Arnon asher b'midbar hayotze migvul ha'emori ki Arnon gvul Moab bein Moab u'bein ha'emori. Okay, we'll stop here, right? And we're not stop here for the day, but let's just stop here and come back and look at what's happening here. Bnei Yisrael have this incident of the snakes. Where does this incident of the snakes take place? Where are they? Where? Before Avot, that's correct. They go. That's why she worked in Beis Yaakov. All right, right. Before Avos, right? They wind up traveling to Avos. But if you remember, right, what happened? What brought the snakes in the first place?
Complaining.
Bnei Yisrael were complaining, right? Bnei Yisrael were complaining. What were they complaining about? Right. So if you remember, they were complaining. They had already journeyed south around the land of Edom. They are soon to come into Eretz Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to accustom them to the ways of the world and to no longer depend on the natural events. They were tired. The man no longer tasted the same. The water no longer tasted the same, right? They were tired. They were bored of the taste, and they complained to Moshe. So they're already traveling south, and now they're going south around Edom, and now they are turning north to head upwards, right? Upwards into the plains of Moab, which would today be considered what? Jordan, right? Upwards into the plains of Moab, which would today would be considered Jordan. And you can see it if you go. There's a place called Mitzpeh Yericho. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Mitzpeh Yericho. If you go to Mitzpeh Yericho, Mitzpeh means an outlook or overlook. Maybe overlook is the better word, right? If you stand at Mitzpeh Yericho, you look down into the valley, and you look down into the valley, and you see literally there is this valley. In the middle of you see Yericho, you see the town of Yericho. In the middle of the valley is what? In the middle of the valley is the Yarden. On the other side, there's more valley, and then it goes up to the mountains of Moab. All right? So you literally see this plain, right, which is right there. And Bnei Yisrael cross over that plain, and of course the first city when they come into Eretz Yisrael, when we get to Sefer Yehoshua, we'll learn through that. They come to, stick with me, right? They come, right? Another 36 years at least, right? They come to Yericho, so they have to head north because they're down south by Edom. Now they have to head northwards, and that's what's being recorded here, is this journey northwards. Okay, I want you to look at Rashi, page 850. Rashi gives us some insight into these places, but Rashi also teaches us something interesting. Look at Pasuk Yud Aleph in Rashi. It is on the right column. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up. 6 lines up from the bottom on the right column. We say they traveled to Avos, and from Avos they traveled and they came to this place which was known as Iyeh HaAvarim. The English translates Iyeh HaAvarim as they encamped in the desolate passes, right? Iyeh HaAvarim are the desolate passes. So the word Avarim, right, is a pass. La'avur, those are passes. And Iyeh, Rashi tells us, is Lashon Chorva, right? It's the language of destruction. So there were these desolate passes. We'll see in a minute what. So Rashi says, B'iyeh ha'avarim, 6 lines up from the bottom. Rashi says, Lo yadati lama nikra shmam iyim. I don't know why they were called iyim, why they were called this language of iyim. V'i al ayin yud lashon chorvahu. It's a language of destruction. And Rashi now brings a number of passages where we see the lashon of a word with an ayin yud, meaning destruction. And therefore we have to assume that that's why the English translates it as desolate passes. But Rashi continues, and Rashi says, Derech ma'avar ha'ovrim sham es har nevo el eretz Canaan shehu mafsik bein eretz Moav le'eretz ha'amori. Right, we are getting here the geographical locations that there was a pass that separated the lands of Moab, right? The lands of Moab and the lands of the Emori. All right? Who was the Emori? Anybody remember? Okay, we'll come to that. Will be important as we see these battles coming up. Okay, so they ultimately reached this place, which was Al Pnei Moav Mimizrach Hashemesh. What does Mimizrach Hashemesh mean? What direction is Mizrach? There's an expression called the Mizrach Vant. What's the Mizrach Vant? The eastern wall is the Mizrach Vant. Who sat on the eastern wall? Either the... Okay, so Sue brings a dose of reality into our class. The people who could afford the seats on the Mizrach Vant, right? They were the ones, right? They were the ones who got the Mizrach Vant. Why did people want to be in the Mizrach Vant? It's just the opposite today. It's so interesting. Why did people want to be in the Mizrach Vant? Because when you davened, you faced east, right? They wanted to be by the easternmost wall of the shul. Right, so that was close to where the Aron Kodesh was, because when shuls were constructed in such a way so that when you walked into shul, the entrance to the shul was from the western side, so that you walked into the shul, what happened? In front of you right away was the Aron Kodesh, right? The Aron Kodesh was there because we faced in that direction, right? We faced in that direction. Interestingly, if you think about where the Aron Kodesh was in the Beis Hamikdash, it wasn't on the eastern wall at all. Where was the Aron Kodesh in the Beis Hamikdash? On the western wall. right, on the western wall. If you think, what do we call the kotel? So some people call it the kaisel, right? Other people call it the western wall, right? What is it the western wall of? No, it's not the western wall of the Beis Hamikdash. It is the western retaining wall around Har Habayis. It is the western retaining wall around Har Habayis. If you are facing that western wall, you are facing east. Right? If you are facing that western wall, you are facing east. Why do we daven east? Not because the wall is in the east, right? The wall is in the west, right? Why do we daven facing east? We daven because from where we live, Yerushalayim is in the east. I remember the first time I went to visit our kids who lived up north, and I said to my son-in-law, Lior, where's east? Which direction is east? He said to me, why are you davening towards Jordan? Right? And I'm like, oh, good point. Right? Because if you're north of Yerushalayim, you daven south. Right? And if you're in Eilat, assuming you daven in Eilat, right? If you're in Eilat, which direction do you face? You face north. And if you're in Japan, which direction do you face? You face west. Right? So east, right? East is only a direction from Europe, right? That's why there was a Mizrach Vant, right? From Europe, from America, we face east. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, they face west, right? They face west. Interesting, just an interesting. By the way, do you know that there's really a debate as to whether you should be facing east 90 degrees east or northeast. Do you know why that is? Because your telephone could tell you that, right? So interestingly, your Compass app doesn't tell you that, but if you look at some of these websites that give you the Zmanim for Great Neck, they will give you two directions to face. One is east, regular east, 90 degrees east, right? 90 degrees. If you look on a compass, 90 degrees is east. The other is northeast. Why would we face northeast when we daven? If you get in a plane, right? If you get in a plane and you leave New York and you fly at a compass heading of 90 degrees the entire trip, where are you going to wind up? Where? Not in Russia, no. In South America, right? In other words, if you go, not South America, but I don't know, what's Egypt or what's south of Egypt, I don't know. Because since the world is round, right? Since the world is round, if you fly 90 degrees straight, you are going to wind up south of Israel, right? You're going to wind up south of Israel. What's below Egypt? What's below Egypt on the map? Africa. Oh, you wind up in Africa. Okay, you wind up in Africa. So you never fly straight across at 90 degrees. There is when you fly, the plane goes in a northeasterly direction, and that's how it ultimately gets to. Right? You look at a map of how the plane flies, you look at the route the plane flies, it goes in the northeast. So there are those who say if you want to face Yerushalayim, you should face in a northeasterly direction, not only in an easterly direction, in a northeasterly direction. What? But that's only if you live in, Europe or the Americas. If you live in Japan or China, right, you are facing where the sun sets, not where the sun rises. The sun sets in the west in Japan also, I believe, right? So we have to ask Chuck, I don't know. Right, the sun sets in the west in Japan also. So we have this idea that depending upon where you are. It's a very offsetting, off-putting experience. If you travel to the Far East and you suddenly find yourself davening in a different direction than you are accustomed to davening. Okay. So Bnei Yisrael are traveling now north, and they're traveling through all of these places, and they come to this place, Al Pnei Moav Mimizrach Hashemesh, which Rashi says is B'mizracha Shel Eretz Moav. They are on the eastern side of the land of Moab. Remember, Moab goes to the Jordan River, right? The mountains of Moab, and then the plains of Moab. The land of Moab went to the Jordan River. So Bnei Yisrael are now winding up on the east of the land of Moab. They're going to have to cross through the land of Moab to get into Eretz Yisrael. Now, they're just like Edom came out and said to them, they said, we want to travel through your land. And Edom said no. What's going to happen with Moab? Right? We're going to have the same kind of experience, right? That Bnei Israel are going to want to travel through Moab to get into the land of Israel. And we're going to have a war with Moab. When it came to Edom, Hashem said no. Hashem said, you can't go wage war with them. You have to travel around them. We don't get the same response with Moab. Okay. Pasuk Yudalid, what do we have? Al Kain Ye'amer B'Sefer Milchamos Hashem Es Vahav B'Sufa V'es HaNechalim Arnon V'asher HaNechalim Asher Nata L'Shebes Ar V'Nishan L'Gvul Moav. Very strange psukim, right? What is going on here? Look at the English. The English says, therefore it is said in the book of the wars of Hashem, right? The book of the wars of Hashem. Anybody have that book at home? No. The book of the wars of Hashem. What is that talking about? What is the book of the wars of Hashem? So let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, Kishemisaprim nisim shena'asu la'avosenu, that when they tell over the miracles that were done to our ancestors. So it seems, according to Rashi, that there was actually a book that Bnei Yisrael had at one point, and this book that Bnei Yisrael had at one point recorded the miracles of the wars that occurred, and we are going to now talk about one of those wars. And this is the war against Moab. We're going to talk a little bit more about this book, Sefer Milchamos Hashem. But are there any other books that you know of that we at one time have that we no longer have? Anybody ever hear of Sefer HaYetzirah? You've heard of the Golem, right? You've heard of the Golem, right? How was the Golem created? Who created the Golem? The Maharal of Prague, right? The Maharal of Prague created the Golem. Have you ever been to Czechoslovakia, right? If you've been to the shul in Prague, all right, they say that there's an attic in the shul in Prague, and that's where the remains of the Golem are. Of course, you can't go up to the attic in the shul of Prague, all right? But that's where they say the remains of the Golem are. The Golem was this creature that was literally brought to life by the Maharal of Prague. What do you mean brought to life by the Maharal of Prague? Since when do we have the ability to bring things to life? So the Gemara actually records that there were rabbis who every Erev Shabbos used to create a calf.
A what?
Calf.
A baby calf.
Yes, a cow, baby cow. And they would slaughter it and they would eat it on Shabbos.
They created themselves and
Created themselves? How did people know how to create things? Sefer HaYetzirah. So there was this book, Sefer HaYetzirah, that we no longer have, that had in it these secrets, formulas of create that these rabbis referred to. I don't know. We'll talk, right? Sefer HaYetzirah. But the reason I wanted to mention this is because there's another Sefer. And since we mentioned Chizkiyahu earlier, we're going to turn our attention again to Chizkiyahu. There was a sefer, there was a book of cures, of medicinal cures, that when people were sick, they would look in this book for the cure for their particular illness.
Was it with the colors?
Colors,
Yeah, like with different.
right? Chizkiyahu destroyed that book. Chizkiyahu destroyed that book of cures. Why?
Used it today.
Right? No, so Thelma's asking a good question. Why did Chizkiyahu destroy that book of cures? Remember what we said earlier about Chizkiyahu, right? Chizkiyahu destroyed the Nachash HaNechoshes. Why? Because he was worried that people would start to trust in this Nachash HaNechoshes like a charm, as opposed to trusting in Hashem. Why did Chizkiyahu destroy this book of cures? For the same reason, because Chizkiyahu was teaching the people that the cures ultimately come from Hashem.
Wasn't he sick too? And then granted,
Chizkiyahu was sick, yes.
He was granted an extra 15 years.
Correct,
because
correct.
of
As to why he was sick, there's some discussion about. He didn't get married, whatever it was. All right, but there was a book of cures that Chizkiyahu destroyed. Again, because he was worried that people were not putting their trust in Hashem, but rather putting their trust in this book of cures, without realizing that it's not the Nachash who kills or heals, it's not the disease that kills or heals, it's ultimately HaKadosh Baruch Hu who does this. So that's our introduction to this Sefer HaMilchamos, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. Okay?